Hello and welcome to week 10 of the Wittgenstein module. And this is the week where we consider the anti-private language argument. So this is the argument that Wittgenstein gives in the middle part of the philosophical investigations. To the effect that it's not possible to have a logically private language. You could, he thinks, have a language which was contingently private. So maybe you had a name that you gave to your relatives. Maybe you're writing in code. So you gave your relatives names, and perhaps you, I don't know, like Tolkien inventing Elvish or whatever, right? You can invent some language like that, so that you could write about your relatives without having to worry about them reading your diaries. But this is a language that could, in principle, be understood by somebody else. Why? Because the objects named are people you could point to, and the properties that you're presumably, the things you're saying about them, whatever you choose to say about your relatives, are properties for which there are public criteria. You know, if you can complain that one of your uncles always, doesn't smell too good, there are sort of publicly available ways of checking that. So somebody else could learn that language in principle. A logically private language is one that's private in the sense that the meanings of the words are given by experiences that only you have. So let's see if I'm the particular green of this book cover. I'm seeing that book cover, and I'm having a particular greeny sort of experience. I can't show that to you. I can show you the book, but I can't show you my my experience of the book. That's all happening, in me. Well, I'm tapping my head, but it's in my consciousness, right? So a logically private language is one where the non-logical terms, the names of things, the referring words, refer to sensations that only I have, right? That will be logically private to me. So we talked about, the naming ceremonies, or the use of an ostensive definition where you're introducing a new colleague and you say, hey, everybody, this is Steve. Right, and that works because I can pat Steve on the back, and you'll know that I'm talking about a person, and it's precisely this person here. That naming ceremony works because we're all in the room with Steve, right? Whereas you're not all in my consciousness. You can't share that green experience. That's only mine, right? Now, Wittgenstein, as we will see, argues that such a language is not possible. That imagining or persuading oneself that one has succeeded in imagining such a language is exactly the kind of error that leads to philosophy, right? It's the kind of it's an example of being trapped by a certain sort of picture that he wants to cure us of. Now, why is this interesting? Well, It's not interesting just because Wittgenstein said it. If he's right about this, then it may have consequences for a whole tradition in philosophy. If you think about back in year one, or possibly even before that, you read some Descartes, right? So he takes you on a thought experiment where he says, look, imagine there isn't a world. I imagine that, that some malicious demon has misled me about the deliverances of my senses, the existence of the physical world, including the existence of my own body. What am I left with? I'm left with my own consciousness, my own conscious awareness, right? So that I'm a thing that thinks, where thinking is understood as more or less as conscious awareness, but also kind of as an activity in Descartes. Now, this requires that we are to imagine that somehow it's possible for Descartes to have the use of language, because Descartes then conducts the rest of the thought experiment through the remaining 6 meditations, well, in either Latin or French, depending on which version you read. So language has to work. Language has to go on working, even under the circumstances of the thought experiment of the first meditation, right? If you think about John Locke's account of the meanings of words, which he bequeaths to Berkeley and Hume and 20th century empiricists like the logical empiricists, the logical positivists, the Vienna Circle. Those are all 3 names for the same lot, more or less. Logical positivists, logical empiricists, Vienna Circle, and the same group. And Bertrand Russell. Bertrand Russell goes for a kind of empiricism where he says, look, if you really understand how language works, if you carry through the program of logical atomism, then you end up in a situation where the only things you can name are your own sensations, because everything else is some sort of logical construct, right? And names have to be simple. So all of these people, all of these, not just empiricists, but Cartesians as well. So this is something that cuts across that 17th century empiricist, intellectualist divide. All of these people are in some way committed to the idea that that a logically private language is not only possible, but is actually what we speak. Remember, Locke isn't describing some sort of philosophically ideal language. He thinks he's giving an account of the languages that we speak, the language that I'm speaking now. So when he says the meaning of the word dog, for me, is a mental image of a dog that I'm carrying around, he means it, right? So that means that somehow in my consciousness, the word dog and this mental image get associated, and that is what the word dog means, at least when I say it. So that's that. This is much discussed, not just because Wittgenstein said it, but because it has a bearing on that whole tradition in philosophy, and may have consequences for philosophy of mind. Now, exactly what consequences depends on exactly what kind of philosopher of mind you are, and exactly what you take Wittgenstein to be saying. And that's that's where all the action is, right? Oh yes, so for example, I mean, the language of thought. Jerry Fodor, you may have come across Jerry Fodor, talks about the language of thought. So roughly speaking, Fodor thought that we do our thinking in a language that's like English or French or Latin, but it's the one our brains use to store and manipulate and to understand content. But when we think, we don't necessarily think in English or whatever your native language is. We think in the language of thought, and then somehow gets translated into the natural language when you speak, and then the hearer translates it into their language of thought when they understand, something like that, right? So in Fodor, well, all right, I mean, I may have been unfair to Fodor there, but he does the phrase "the language of thought" is associated with him. So it's a compelling philosophical picture that it's at least possible in principle to have a whole language running, just inside one person's consciousness. Why did Wittgenstein care, though? Well, if we think back to Tractatus 5.62, which is the bit where he's talking about solipsism. And you'll remember that when he's talking about solipsism, he talks about the metaphysical subject, which sounds like a terribly philosophical thing to say. And he says, the philosophical self is not the human being, not the human body. This is in 5.641 over the page. The philosophical self is rather the metaphysical subject, the limit of the world, not a part of it. And that's the end of section 5. And after that, he's talking about logic and truth functions and numbers and so on. So there he is. That sounds like philosophy, right? From a man who's trying to stop doing philosophy, from a man who's trying to diagnose philosophy, trying to persuade us that whenever you say philosophical things, you're making some sort of mistake. Well, the start of that discussion, 5.62, he's talking about solipsism. He says, the world is my world. This is manifest in the fact that the limits of language mean the limits of my world. But there's a parenthetical remark. There's a bit in brackets. The whole sentence is, the world is my world, italics. This is manifest in the fact that the limits of language, italics, open brackets, of that language which alone I understand, close brackets. So here in the Tractatus, Wittgenstein joins Russell and the rest of the crew in thinking that the core language, that each of us speaks a kind of personal idiolect, that each of us speaks our own version of the language. We each have our own version of English or French or whatever, because our words, at least our words for colours and things we can name, must be set up by associations in our own minds. That I associate the word blue with experiences of blue that I've had, and I associate so on. So, as usual, it's possible to you see the significance of what Wittgenstein's saying by noticing that it would be a wrecking ball to a great swathe of existing philosophy. But the reason he's bothering with it, I think, because he doesn't know much or care much about previous philosophy. The reason he's bothered about it is his ongoing struggle with his earlier self. Okay, some reminders. So I've already touched on this. One is Wittgenstein wants to cure us of the impulse to do philosophy, right? So in all the Wittgenstein interpretation, whenever you get sort of summaries of the state of the art, both of the Tractatus and of the Investigations, the great contest is between what's called the resolute readings and the substantive readings. What are the resolute readings resolute about? They're resolute about the idea that Wittgenstein wants to stop doing philosophy. He doesn't offer any philosophical propositions or theses or doctrines or views. Really, what he's offering is just therapy to help everybody else stop having philosophical views, doctrines, theses. That's the resolute. So the resolute one is we read everything he writes, everything he wrote, with that in mind and assume that he meant it. And so if he seems to be saying something philosophical, we must be reading him wrong. The substantive readings of Wittgenstein, and there are substantive readings of both the Tractatus and the Philosophical Investigations, the substantive readings say, well, yeah, he did say all that, but actually he did have philosophical views. And so we should take the all the stuff about wanting to stop doing philosophy and so on. We should kind of take it lightly or ironically or something like that. Well, it seems to me pretty obvious that they're kind of both right. It seems to be pretty obvious that Wittgenstein wanted us to be able to be read resolutely. He would like it to be the case that if you follow his advice, then philosophy will dissolve. But he runs into the same difficulty that everybody else who's ever announced he isn't the first to announce the end of philosophy. Hume, at the end of the Inquiries, announces the end of philosophy. Kant announces the end of all previous philosophy, all the philosophy that's unlike his. Heidegger. All right, Heidegger is kind of contemporary, but the whole Locke promises to sweep away all the previous philosophy and replace it with scientific good sense. And what all of these characters find, including Wittgenstein, is that whatever gesture you make, whatever device, whatever move you make that is supposed to bring an end to philosophy, inevitably will turn out to have some philosophical content or interest or import, and you will find yourself to have done or said something philosophical in your attempt to bring philosophy to an end. And that's what happens to Wittgenstein. So I think he would have liked the resolute readings to be successful, but he ends up still doing philosophy in spite of himself. Anyway, we get some of that ambition. Let's see, in Philosophical Investigations 255. Where are we? He talks about. Here we go. The philosophy. So first, then he talks about. He says things we're tempted to say, right? In philosophy, only where we have to give a psychologically exact account of the temptation to use a particular kind of expression. So we find ourselves tempted to use that expression in a certain way. And what we're tempted to say in such a case is not philosophy, but it's the raw material, right? So as a philosopher, you hear people saying odd things. Well, you don't regard what they're saying as as philosophy, really. What you regard it as the beginnings of philosophy. So what a mathematician is inclined to say about the objectivity and reliability of mathematical facts is not a philosophy of mathematics, but something for philosophical treatment. And then 255, we get this commitment. The philosopher's treatment of a question is like the treatment of an illness. So, I mean, the treatment of an illness isn't always a cure. Sometimes it's just a mitigation. Okay, so there's that trying to stop doing philosophy ambition. Something that these two books have in common that's already there in the Tractatus and goes long and big in the investigations is this idea that sense is always contrastive, that logic in the Tractatus, you get the thought that logic can't say anything true, because if it were possible for logic to say something true, it would also have to be able to say something false. And like, how do you make sense of that? In the preface to the Tractatus, he says, I want to set limits to thought. Well, I can't really do that, because to set limits to thought, you'd kind of have to think across both sides of it. That doesn't make any sense. So I'm going to try and do it with language. Well, by the end of the book, you find it the same problem arises with language as well. So all the way through. So you get the same sort of stuff about in here in the investigations. The thought that, if it makes sense to talk about being right about something, it must also make sense to talk about being wrong about it. That if you can't be wrong about something, then you can't really be right about it either. The whole business of being right and wrong come together. They come as a package. Say things like, well, look, I can't be wrong about my feelings, because they're in me and they're close to me and I have them, right? I can't be wrong about which emotion I'm feeling. Well, I mean, if that's correct, I'm not sure that is correct, to be honest, but if that's correct, then you couldn't be right about it either, right? He says in back to the Tractatus, he talks about skepticism. Where are we? 6.51. Skepticism is not italics, irrefutable, but obviously nonsensical. When it tries to raise doubts where no questions can be asked. For doubt can exist only where a question exists, a question only where an answer exists, and an answer only where something can be said. So there you have this kind of contrastive argument that skeptics try to raise doubts. How do you know that I've got a trust me, I've got a cup on the desk over here just out of shot. How do I know that there is a cup on the desk? Well, that sounds like it's raising a doubt, but if you just pursue the skeptical question, you'll see that the way the skeptical question is posed excludes the possibility of answering it. But if you can't answer it, it's not really a question. So if it's not really a question, then it's not really a doubt, right? So that line of argument, I mean, it's just there very briefly in the Tractatus, but it's kind of the structuring thought all the way through this stuff about private language. And you find it in his last work on certainty, when he goes back to talk more about epistemology. Okay. So there's the contrastive argument that, like I say, is there in the Tractatus, there as well, only bigger and longer in many more cases in the investigations. One of the things that's new in the investigations that's not there in the Tractatus is the two voices. One of the things that makes the investigations difficult to read until you disentangle them is that there are two voices. One is the voice of the person who is in the grip of the philosophical picture that Wittgenstein is trying to release us from. And the other voice is the voice of Wittgenstein trying to cajole, suggest, unpick that picture, to help that picture sort of lose its grip. And there's a back and forth. So in a way, once you get used to this does make, it's one of the things that makes the investigations a bit easier to read, because with the Tractatus, as we saw, it's not obvious who he's arguing against. As we discovered, the more you know about Bertrand Russell and logical atomism, the easier it is to read the Tractatus, because a lot of the time that's who Wittgenstein is fencing with, though he doesn't say so. So that's new. That's something that's in the investigations. And the first example of that kind of contrastive argument comes at Investigations 246. So I'll do that slowly, because it is quite a subtle point that bears. So in the previous bit, sort of 238, 239, he's been talking about rule following, and one of the rules, one of the last rules that he considers is about colours. So somebody says, how is someone to know what colour to pick out when he hears red? Well, comes the answer, and this isn't Wittgenstein. This is, this is the bad spirit. The bad spirit says, quite simple, he is to take the colour whose image occurs to him when he hears the word. Really, says Wittgenstein, how is he to know which colour it is whose image occurs to him? Is a further criteria needed for that? So then there's a bit of 239. There's a bit of worry about how we're able to recognise colours, how we're able to use colour words correctly, and the suggestion that we're able to use colour words correctly because we have a kind of something like a colour chart, like you would get from decorators' supplies, only we've got it, rather than having in your hand, you have it in your mind, in your consciousness. You can somehow look it up and know what red means. Okay, so then we get into the reading for this week. 244, how do words refer to sensations? Well, and he says, look, this seems okay. We talk about sensations every day and we give them names, right? So or we seem to at least. You know, that headache's back. There's some people have a particular name for the kind of brief headache you get from biting into an ice cream when the ice cream freezes the bones in the front of your face chills the bones in the front of your face, and you get a kind of specific kind of chill pain briefly across the bones in your skull from that, right? So that has a name, ice cream death. So we did that, right? They've named a sensation. Well, I mean, here's a point. How does that get set up? Well, here's a possibility, says Wittgenstein. Words are connected with the primitive natural expressions of the sensation and used in their place. So a child hurts itself and cries, but later the child learns that instead of crying, you can say ow, or you might say, you know, ow, that hurt, or something like that. You might use words. Right. So maybe that's how. But it's not that the word pain names the behavior. Rather, it's the pain talk replaces the crying, or you know, maybe supplements that. You can still cry when you're grown up if it hurts badly enough, but you can also say, ow, that hurts, or if somebody doesn't seem very sympathetic, you might say, look, I'm in pain. But why would you say that? Well, if they'd failed to read you, right? That already is kind of already pointing to the use that the word pain has for us, that it's no longer just a name that's supposed to work by being attached as a label to something, and then we have to worry about what that something is. But rather, the word is given a job to do. And we've already seen that for Wittgenstein, what job does this work do amongst us is the question that he prefers, rather than what does the word mean. Because jobs, there's nothing metaphysically weird about a role in a practice. Okay. So the little contrastive argument in 246, he talks about, you know, in what sense are my sensations private? Well, somebody says, only I can know whether I'm really in pain. Another person can surmise it. Say, well, I mean, that isn't really true, is it? Right? I mean, people very often know perfectly well when somebody else is in pain. I mean, if, you know, somebody takes a whack and they exhibit pain behavior and they protect the injured limb and they moan and they look around for medical help. I mean, this is a person in pain, right? But then you make a philosophical move and say, oh yeah, but they could be faking. I mean, they're not faking it, right? Somebody they just took a whack with a brick, right? I mean, yeah. Yes, but you know, they might be an android, or they might be one of these rare people who can't feel pain, and they might be faking it because they know that we would be freaked out. Right. This is now entering into skeptical territory, right? Where there's a prior decision just to not to allow the word knowledge to get any grip. But if we don't go down that road, if we just kind of refuse entry to the philosophical skeptic, then yeah, we know this person's in pain. These are the very circumstances in which human beings experience pain, and everything about them says this hurts. So here's the contrastive bit, which I've been working up to for the last 10 minutes. He says, other people cannot be said to learn of my sensations only from my behaviour, for I cannot be said to learn of them. I have them. Right? So, to unpack this, somebody says, other people learn of my sensations only from my behaviour. That requires, that entails and requires a contrast, that other people learn about my sensations in one way and I learn about my sensations in another. Other people learn about my sensations indirectly through my behaviour. I learn about my sensations by some more direct route. Well, that isn't right. I don't learn about my sensations at all. I just have them, right? They just, what would it mean to learn about my sensations slowly or inaccurately or incompletely? I mean, learning can be, learning can misfire in all sorts of ways. If I were learning about my sensations, it should be possible for learning about my sensations to misfire, but it can't, right? So talk about me learning about my sensations doesn't get any grip, doesn't make any sense. I just have my sensations. But if I don't learn about my sensations, then the contrast between the way I learn about my sensations and the way others learn about my sensations doesn't mean anything either, right? Because one half of the contrast doesn't exist. The how I learn about my sensations side just doesn't exist. I don't learn about my sensations. But then what does it mean to say that other people learn about my sensations only from my behavior, right? That contrast dies. Okay. So that's an example of that contrastive mode of argument, making a fairly subtle point. And he starts to introduce, he doesn't use the word grammar here, that comes a bit later. But the next line he says, only you can know if you had that sensation. Now, that sounds like a proposition, right? That sounds like somebody might be told something. It's like it's a fact that only you can know if you had that intention. Well, it's not a fact. If it's a fact about anything, it's a fact about the way the word intention is used. Because again, I don't know that I have a certain intent. I mean, I just, Now, all of this, it seems to me, I mean, I'll say this now because you may be anticipating it. All of this seems to be vulnerable to the fact that we are capable of not knowing ourselves terribly well, that our inner life has layers and depths, and we can misunderstand ourselves and not know what our intentions are. Somebody picks up a baseball bat and leaves the house, and they don't really know where they're going or what they're going to do. But as a matter of fact, they march around to somebody else and threaten them. Well, in some sense, that was always their intent, because they just went and did it. But they maybe didn't realize this because they're in a kind of red haze, red mist. We can lie to ourselves. We're capable of self-deception. So it does seem to me that, and I don't want to get I don't sidetracked on this, because the first task is to understand what Wittgenstein is saying before we start deciding whether we think it's true. But just to put down a marker, you might legitimately think about some of this stuff. Not so much the stuff about colours, but when he talks about things like intentions, desires and so on, it seems to me that things are more complicated than some of these arguments allow for. Okay. So here we go. Yes, the proposition sensations are private. So we're back. We've retreated from intentions to the safer territory of sensations. The proposition sensations are private, this is 248, is comparable to one plays patience by oneself. Games again, right? Remember, patience is a card game where you sit and you play it by yourself. It's a pastime. It's a solo pastime with a pack of cards and a set of rules. Right. Why can't a dog simulate pain? Now we get, this is the interesting thing. One of the things that's going through Wittgenstein that we'll come to in a bit is when he says to imagine a language is to imagine a form of life. That means both to imagine a way of life, but also to imagine a life form. So let's see. If you think about the word loyalty, the word loyalty, or actually my favorite example, fealty, F-E-A-L-T-Y, which is the particular kind of loyalty that you owe to your liege lord under feudalism. So it's an antique and disused ethical concept, fealty. Fealty only makes sense if you're living under feudalism. You can't owe fealty to somebody. You can't claim fealty to somebody unless, if you're living in some other social system. You might expect loyalty from, friends or a spouse or family members, but you can't expect fealty. It's a specific set of duties that only make sense under feudalism. But fealty also only makes sense because we are a social species with a hierarchy. Well, where hierarchy seems to be normal, where we're capable of hierarchy. And it only makes sense because we're the kind of species that fights, because part of fealty is to do military service for your liege lord. If we were animals like, I don't know, solitary whales, where they only come together for breeding and then spend the rest of their lives swimming the oceans alone, where there weren't any social relations apart from sort of the brief relationship established by courtship that only lasts as long as the mating, and then the mother-child relationship that only lasts until the child leaves the mother. So we didn't have the kind of, just biologically, we imagine ourselves not having the kind of biological lives that would allow the concept of fealty to get a grip. So our ability to use language depends partly on cultural stuff, how we live, stuff that changes over time, stuff that's historically and socially variable, but also ultimately on our species being, on our animal nature, on the kinds of animals we are. So the dog, and the dogs appear as contrasts some of the time here. Why can't a dog simulate pain? Is he too honest? Right? Well, no, because honesty doesn't really apply to dogs. Could one teach a dog to simulate pain? Well, perhaps he could teach him to howl on particular occasions, even when, as if he were in pain, even when he's not. You could train a dog to do that. But it wouldn't be simulation. It would just be the dog obeying instructions to howl. Okay. Why? Because dogs aren't complicated in the right kind of way. The whole business of communication. Dogs communicate, but they don't communicate in ways that would allow simulation or dissimulation to enter the picture, says Wittgenstein. So back to 251. Here is the contrastive argument again. What does it mean to say, I can't imagine the opposite of this? Or what would it be like if it was otherwise? For example, when someone has said that my images are private, or that only I myself can know whether I'm feeling pain and similar things. Well, when I say I can't imagine the opposite, it doesn't mean my powers of imagination are unequal to the task. It means it's impossible to imagine the opposite. Well, if you can't imagine the opposite, then you can't imagine the thing itself, right? That's his contrastive reasoning again. That one sign of philosophy happening, Wittgenstein seems to think, is if we say that one side of a contrast is impossible or unimaginable or makes no sense, but apparently the other side of the contrast is imaginable or does make sense, or we want to talk about it. Well, we're probably making a philosophical mistake there, is part of his argument. So well, there's the whole, we're on to 50 minutes. So there's the whole argument about public criteria, that if somebody tried to put a mark in a diary every day when they felt a certain sensation, how would they know they were getting it right? If I put a mark in a diary every day when I don't know, when I saw a certain person, imagine there's a dog walker who passes the house every day, and for some bizarre, creepy reason, I decide I'm going to put a mark in my diary every day when I see this person pass. And one day I see somebody go past, go, aha, it's them, and I put the mark. And then I look again, they're going past quite slowly. They've stopped because the dog has stopped to sniff something. And I look more closely and go, oh, no, it's not that person. Okay, now rub the mark out, right? There's something that it means to get that right and get it wrong. But if I was putting a mark in a diary every day when I felt a certain sensation, it's supposed to have the same kind of shape to it. It's supposed to be the same kind of exercise. Look to see each day whether something happens and put a mark in your diary if it does. But how could you be wrong, right? You have a sensation and you find yourself thinking, yeah, that's that sensation. But how could you be wrong about it, right? Well, if you can't be wrong about it, you can't be right. That's Wittgenstein's thought. More examples of animal life. So 281. Yeah. So look, somebody says to him, this is the bad spirit. The bad spirit speaks again and says, but doesn't what you say come to this? There is no pain, for example, without pain behavior. And that you can see that is a, if that's what Wittgenstein was saying, it would be false, right? Because sometimes people stifle pain behavior. Sometimes people just endure. You know, if you have toothache at a funeral, you'd, you know, actually, if you're at a funeral, you could probably do some wailing and just pass it off as bereavement. But I don't know, some other occasion, some solemn occasion when it would be inappropriate to center your toothache. So people do that. So clearly, he can't be saying if there's no pain, if there's no pain behavior, there's no pain, because sometimes there is pain without pain behavior. We know that. He says, no, it comes to this. Only of a living human being and what resembles or behaves like a living human being can one say it has sensations, it sees, is blind, hears, is deaf, is conscious or unconscious. Right? So we can only really talk about, whether something feels pain, if that something is sufficiently like us. Then there are hard cases like flies, that flies are very different from us. We don't, I mean, you can be fairly sure when a dog is in pain. Why? Because dogs are mammals. They're sufficiently like us that we can be fairly confident when a dog is in pain or lonely or unhappy or distressed, right? Because their lives, it's not just that their pain behavior is sufficiently like ours, their lives are sufficiently like ours. Now, when a fly is injured, it might lie on its back and kick its legs. Is it in pain? Well, that looks like pain behavior. Don't know. People persuaded themselves for a long time that fish don't feel pain. What are the lives of octopuses like? Curious thing, people feel more and more inclined to attribute pain experience to octopuses. The more they learn about octopus intelligence, the more they learn about octopuses using tools or, hunting, doing clever hunting behavior that seems to involve having some kind of theory of mind. But why do we think that kind of cleverness and susceptibility to pain are in any way connected? There's no reason why there's no conceptual reason why they should be. But the more we learn about the cleverness, and especially that there's a kind of artful dodger quality to a lot of octopus cleverness, we feel more inclined to recognize them as the kind of creatures that might feel pain. Why? Because we see more of ourselves in them. Wittgenstein says somewhere that if a lion could speak, we couldn't understand it. Well, I think it rather depends on what the lion was talking about. If the lion was, limping and moaning, okay, maybe we wouldn't call that speaking, but we would be confident that it was the lion was in pain. Yeah, says somebody. So the evil voice, the evil spirit says, yeah, but in a fairy tale, a pot can see and hear. And yeah, says Wittgenstein, but a pot can also talk. And, you know, that only gets going because you invent a pot that's sufficiently human-like, right? And in pots in Disney, they don't just see and hear and talk. They also sing and dance and have, you know, hold hands with other crockery. I mean, you know, there's some stuff here about stones having sensations, which kind of goes the same way. And then in the 290s, we get the beetle in the box. So this is a slightly different argument. So this isn't an argument that says about pain behavior. This is about this is focusing back more squarely on how words have meanings. And he says, look, supposing everybody had a box, a matchbox. For younger viewers, a matchbox is about this big. A matchbox. And everybody had something in the matchbox that they called my beetle, that nobody else ever saw. And that expression, my beetle, had some kind of use in the language. Like, you know, I looked at my beetle, I don't know what use it would have, but there's something we do. But nobody ever shows anybody else their beetle. So maybe my beetle box has got an actual dead beetle in. Maybe yours has got a button. Maybe somebody else's is completely empty. It wouldn't matter if all the things in the boxes were different, or even if all the boxes were empty. Because we never open the boxes, the contents of the boxes don't do anything, can't do anything to support the use of the word, the phrase, my beetle, to do whatever work it does in the language. Well, sensations are like that you might try naming your sensations if you want, and you might try convincing yourself that you can successfully do it. Maybe you aren't convinced by the previous arguments about, you know, naming there's no criterion for rightness or wrongness in the naming of sensations. Maybe you're not convinced by that. Maybe you think you can name sensations. Okay, fine. Let's imagine that you've named a sensation. What possible help could that private sensation have in supporting the use in the language of the word with which you've named it? That's the kind of skeptical question about the beetle in the box. And I mean, this is kind of interesting. Anything that people imagine to be locked away in their own consciousness, but is nevertheless important and has a name, seems to be susceptible to the beetle in the box argument, if it works. So he spends a bit longer fighting off the suggestion that he's trying to deny things that we know to be true. So 305, he says, you surely cannot deny that, for example, in remembering, an inner process takes place. That's the bad spirit speaking, right? Well, says what? Wittgenstein, now speaking in his own voice, what makes you think I want to deny anything? all this, what does this talk about inner processes mean? When somebody says there's an inner process of remembering, all they mean is you remember, right? There's talk about inner processes doesn't add anything to ordinary talk about remembering, but it sneaks in a picture of a certain sort, right? So the idea is, we've got we're familiar with processes, bureaucratic processes, the process for getting some expenses paid, or a chemical process, the process for, I don't know, distilling alcohol or something. So then we talk about a memory process, but we don't have anything. It doesn't attach to anything, right? What that does is it commits us to a picture of remembering that is somehow modeled on processes we do understand, like claiming expenses or brewing beer. And that commitment, all that commitment has is the word process. It doesn't have any kind of philosophical argument or heft. And the same thing with states. Talk about the state of my finances, or the state of your shoes covered in mud or whatever. And then we talk about mental states. And again, there's a kind of analogy being made, but with no kind of license. Okay. And this leads you, it's being committed to that picture that Wittgenstein claims leads a person to imagine that Wittgenstein's arguments commit Wittgenstein to behaviorism. Right? All of this Wittgensteinian stuff sounds like behaviorism to someone who's committed to the kind of pictures about the mind that Wittgenstein wants to cure you of. And just to have a reminder of that's what the ambition is. 309. What is your aim in philosophy? To show the fly the way out of the fly bottle. So the idea is, if you're doing philosophy, if you're talking about mental states and mental processes, or grappling with the problem of other minds, or whatever, or inverted spectrum problems, or any of that kind of stuff, you are like a fly that's got trapped inside a bottle that's been designed for trapping flies. And what Wittgenstein wants to do is not give you answers to your philosophical problems, but just to help you escape from them, escape from the trap, the kind of language trap that got you into it. The words like process and name and state lay traps for you, because they have a certain grammar, they come with a certain picture, and they seem very, very familiar. The process of claiming expenses, process of brewing beer, the state of your shoes, the state of your finances, process talk and state, and the names of your friends, right? Processes and states and names seem very familiar, but they impose a certain picture. And if we carry that picture with us when we think about things like remembering or experiencing sensations, then we'll find ourselves with philosophical headaches. So this is again a moment where Wittgenstein wants to push this idea that the proper activity of philosophy is this kind of therapy, this kind of, look, let me just show you how you got the disease of philosophy, and somehow, having shown how you got into it, will show you the way out of it, and you will then willingly leave. Because what happens is that the fly, the philosophical fly, seems, in many cases, seems to like the inside of the fly bottle, doesn't regard it as a trap. And I think it's quite plausible to claim that Wittgenstein ends up making substantive philosophical commitments, and you see that from the fact that philosophers of mind inspired by Wittgenstein find themselves with plenty to say, find themselves able to commit to, find themselves driven to commit to substantive theses about the nature of mind. Now, maybe they're doing Wittgenstein wrong, or, and this is where I'm putting my money, maybe Wittgenstein's confidence that if you just study the grammar, the philosophical grammar of our language carefully enough, you can somehow dissolve all the philosophical questions. His confidence in that, I think, was misplaced.